on screen as they need to be portrayed. I think one of the projects that I worked on, which I was happiest with, was Hair Tales, which was Tracy Ellis Ross, and that particular project, because there were a lot of different subjects in that, and that was one of our first titles that we delivered in Dolby Vision. One of the first, not the first, but one of the first, which was a great process. And I know we spoke about HDR first, SDR first, things like that. This was Dolby Vision first, and with that, we tried to make sure that we represented everyone as accurately as we possibly could. Now, it was documentary style, so there wasn't a lot of creative, environment as well. But we always, like JP said, we use our galleries as our guides, we use our scopes as our guides, and try to deliver the vision best we can.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. And the last comment that I want to give from my perspective, outside of this technical role and the colorist role, is there was a comment yesterday, I think, in animations and how some of these things are created by people that are meant for a certain group of people, but maybe they're not coming from that group of people. So I think we were talking in animation how there are a lot of maybe African themes, but maybe they weren't made by people who are from that culture, and how that doesn't necessarily feel connections the same way. What I want to encourage whenever I look at the field of color scientists or colorists is a lack of diversity and representation, and the recognition of how we're taking these creative projects. I think it's wonderful that we are always trying to be respectful and honor what those representations are and want to be true to those humans. But I think it's important that we have more voices, and bringing that representation in so that people are feeling included, and we are increasing our diversity so that different people's perspectives and creativity and cultures are reflected in their art that they're creating. So if you're someone out there who is curious about this side of the field, I encourage you to get involved, because I would love to be able to look around at the colorists who I meet, or be able to go to a website like the Color Society and look at their membership and start to see a more diverse reflection of this side of the industry. So with that, thank you both so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking with you and getting to learn about your processes. And let's go ahead and give them a round of applause. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yes. Before you guys leave the stage, do we have any questions for our panelists? Oh, yeah. We want to make sure for our online audience.
Yes, great presentation. I'm Andre Nomiel. I'm with CMT local section here for the Atlanta section, and former employee of Warner Brothers. So I'm an engineer, and I used to design and implement a lot of the technologies that you guys are using right now to create content. Now, the question I have, I know there's a lot of effort and, creativity, for color correction, making sure that the content that you're creating, is correct, as you're sending it out to the end users. My question is from the end user's perspective. We know now content are being consumed on different platforms, iPhone, iPad, computers, different type of display. All your effort to make sure the colors are represented. How do we make sure that they are seeing the colors as you intended on the end user side? Because we know there's no, in a production or post-production environment, you have engineers that can go into your suites and calibrate your monitor to make sure it's up to standard, but you don't have that from the user's perspective. And Catherine, a question for you. Out of your scientists, you've been working on software, calibration software. Can we use AI today to make sure that end user devices can be calibrated so the colors are represented as intended by the creative artist?
I'm going to ask Catherine actually if she has an AI answer, but I will say that she touched on this a little bit in the color management pipeline. So the color management pipeline is one of the first safeguards against that particular problem. You also have things like, I'm going to mention Dolby Vision, that is a display-centric thing from the bit stream that is serving that media. So, for example, with Dolby Vision, if a Dolby Vision thing, which our phones are actually capable of receiving that. You know, the iPhones from 12 on, I think, are capable of receiving Dolby Vision signal. So the bit stream would convert that into the correct presentation for that device. Now, I can't answer the AI question, but maybe Catherine can. I don't want to put you on the spot.
I'll touch on it a little bit. It's actually a field of research at Portrait Displays. We're really curious with the power of AI when it comes to display calibration, especially end users and the widespread of distribution that exists today. How can we take advantage of that technology? And the most important aspect where I think it's really beneficial is learning about the display. So a lot of color management, we talked about understanding your device color space, understanding its transfer characteristics. The same thing applies in calibration. So are we able to gather a lot of data to start to learn faster and quicker about how a display is behaving? And that can allow us to get to a calibration faster. That is my particular aspect that I'm really interested in exploring and seeing. Can we prevent someone from having to have a really nice color measurement device or spend hours collecting a lot of measurements in order to make sure their display is an accurate representation of the space that's being intended? Probably have time for 2 more questions, maybe 3.
Good morning. Awesome panel. My question is, you mentioned Dolby Vision, and we were sitting here and we weren't aware of it. And so we recently completed a recording studio that's going to be Dolby Atmos certified. So a couple of questions. Do the two go hand in hand? What is Dolby Vision? And as an institution, how can we, or if we should integrate this into the learning environment, what are the tools and resources that we would need to do that? And should this be a first year introductions to students, second year, third year, or something?
Dolby Vision, I want to make a distinction because I think the terms HDR and Dolby Vision get used interchangeably, and I want to make sure that I put a line in the sand on that. Dolby Vision is a packaging platform for HDR delivery with a derived master for other displays. So, for example, Dolby Vision can go from SDR to HDR or HDR to SDR or anything in between. Okay, we can start in SDR and move that up to HDR and deliver it for that platform. The purpose of Dolby Vision is to send out the same result to different displays, okay, through the bit stream. So if I have that result on an iPhone, or if I have that result on a 650 nit LG TV, or if I have that result on a 100 nit, call it, I don't know, some other sort of Pixio display or something like that, that I see the same representation of the creative intent on each of those displays. And that's done by a derived master. So the Dolby Vision process will actually take that media, and this is a high level overview, but that will take that media and create derived masters for each different target. So if you have a 1,000 nit display target, a 650 nit display target, a 400 nit display target, or a 100 nit display target, you would get derived masters for all of those. I think the second part of your question, is it worth putting in the education pipeline? Is that what you're saying? Absolutely. Because any of these delivery platforms and any of these delivery methodologies, I think, are just going to evolve over time. And so, and continue to evolve. So absolutely, I think that is something that would be very interesting in an educational pipeline. I'm sorry? At what depth? At what level? That is I would say it's a high level. Thank you, Neil, for putting your hand up like that. I appreciate it. I would agree with that because the Dolby Vision packaging process is fairly technical, especially when we get into the IMF characteristics of it, the IMF packaging and delivery to the different displays. So I think that is a very high level situation.
No, you can't.
Anybody else? Christian, I know you had. Oh, I'm sorry.
We just have one more. I guess.
Good morning. I wanted to ask this question to you, Catherine, on the last session. My early days of teaching TV production and so on, and when green screen got popular, I noticed from the literature it said that you could do either blue screen or green screen, but the industry has overwhelmingly chose to do green screening, even though there's some blue screening from my research. And I'm just wondering what, for our students and so on, what's the main reason why green screening is more important. Why was that color chosen over blue?
I'll take a stab and then we'll see if this is right. From a technical perspective, green is the color that tends to have the most energy and information and tends to be what we can best pick up from a sensor response. So using green is one of those clear signals when we're wanting to create a differentiation for that. So I think that's a technical aspect to where that comes from. Blue is actually the one that tends to have the least amount of sensitivity. So it can pick up a lot more noise and other problems that can come in through image processing.
The only other change would be wardrobe, right?
I wanted to add that when you see noise in an image, you tend to see the noise in the blue channel. So from what she was saying, that is also a differentiator. It's also environmental, I think, as well, depending on wardrobe and things like that as well.
Hello. Hi. Good morning. Question. Did I hear you say monitors are starting to develop to where they essentially, in layman's terms, see themselves and take data from the internet, et cetera, and then fix itself?
There's auto calibration. Yeah.
Yeah. So to the AI question, is that what you're referring to from before that I was answering? I don't know that that's being built into the displays themselves necessarily. It's something I'm curious about from a calibration software perspective of if we can gather data from displays and do that. I think it's very interesting to think about what would happen if that information lived on the display. That's a certainly interesting avenue. I think that there's a lot of interest going on in display technology right now of how do we really characterize what the display is capable of, and then how do we use that to do color management within the device. So when we're talking about Dolby Vision, for example, that's a situation where you have a container that requires the display to have some knowledge of its characteristics in order to do its job properly. So I think it's a curious aspect. Yeah, what would happen if a display could have a chip on it that had that information and could do things?
There's no reason it shouldn't be able to, right?
The only question is, oops, sorry, I will fix that in a moment. The only question I would have from just my experience working with different display manufacturers is how much space you have on your electronics and how much processing and how much energy it takes to do that kind of manipulation. Right now, I know as we're trying to get wider color gamuts and wider dynamic range, it's causing a lot of power issues, and power consumption is a very serious thing that displays are keeping out, especially consumer displays. So if you want to add this knowledge of auto calibration with this data stored in a display, how does that affect the rest of the behavior? Is what I think they would be considering when trying to apply that technology within themselves.
My main question was really about the scopes versus the creative, and in post, how do you manage yourself in regards to a properly set up image according to your gallery and according to your charts versus the creative discussion, that people want, and that thin line between what's good image making and what the artist wants?
Grant does, again, going back to how we get involved early, even with the production, production sends displays, monitors to us all the time, and we calibrate SpectraCal. And so we were involved in that at the very beginning, making sure that on set, what you're doing has a calibration as well to a delta E value and under that we target. But Grant internally calibrates every display in our house every few months, and we have to keep. We have to do that. They do drift. They will drift. I wish they didn't, but they do. They still drift. Yes. Yeah.
I think one of the aspects that you were asking was when we're looking at scopes and as we get further down the process, how do we look at what's technically correct and what is creatively acceptable? Is that kind of what? So again, someone like yourself or a DP or a director would be driving that vision, and we stay within that realm. So, but when we do a look dev in the beginning of production, or when we do a look dev when we do a spotting session, the creative is agreed upon. The technical is up to us, right? So retaining values in the blacks, retaining values in the whites, retaining values in the mids, that is our responsibility, but staying true to the creative vision that we've established with our spotting session or in the capture is also our responsibility. So we tend to ask for references. You know, do we want, do it like a pitch deck or a look deck or something like that, and stay within those realms. On scopes, as far as that's concerned, I use Nobe Omniscope, and Nobe Omniscope will actually split my vector scope into 3 mediums, low, medium, and high. So I can see where those values are, not just on an overlay vector scope, but in 3 different pieces. So I know that if I'm adding cyan or teal to shadows, I know where that is. It's not overlaid in a massive vector scope. I can see what that's doing. And so I can go into the log control and move that around, and I can see that just in that realm. And so that across the entire picture, if you're talking about a 1600 clip picture, is worth its weight in gold, because I can see how much blue is in the shadow, or I can see how much orange is in the mids, or I can see, you know, wherever it might be, I can totally see that. And so from a matching perspective, on a 1600 clip film, 2000 clip film, whatever it is, I have those tools available to me to make sure that I'm linear and not skewing all over the place. Now, different scenes may be different things. Obviously, we might have a different setup where it's super warm and I'm not putting all of that cyan in, but I can stay, I'm gonna call it neutral throughout the entire picture, to where I'm not trying to take the viewer out of it. And that's my goal every time, is to never, ever let the viewer go, wait a minute, this looks different. I never want that to happen. Hopefully that answers the question. Thank you, Christian.
Sorry. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. John and Grant are from Moonshine Post, which is in Old 4th Ward, I believe, so not far away from here. It's a full post-production facility, so if you staff or students, if you have any interest in post, definitely try to catch these guys while they're here. And of course, Catherine is just brilliant. I know a lot about picture editing and sound design and whatnot, but color, she makes me feel like I just need to sit down and with a color book or something, because I have no idea. But yeah, she just explains everything so well with color science. So absolutely talk to her. If anything she said piqued your interest, this is someone you want to talk to about that. Color, I've only met in 15 years in LA. I've probably met less than 10 people of color that are colorists. I haven't met any color scientists. Catherine, you'd have to let me know. Only 2 or 3 of them are Black women. I was hoping that they'd be able to join us this year, and I'm talking to them about coming next year. If anyone's interested in color, I'll be happy to try to connect you with them, you know, today. So anyway, it is a very interesting field, and there's a lot more representation that needs to be had there to make sure that it's consistent throughout the workflow, that visually we are seen and accurately seen. So we have to truncate the break to about 5 minutes. Dr. Ellis Monk is going to be joining us virtually. The presentation is going to be on colorism in AI and the Monk skin tone scale. So definitely something that's really important for the future. So 5 minutes, health break, quick coffee break, stretch. But please join us back at noon sharp. Thank you.
So our next presentation, we have it as a remote presentation. Joining us from Harvard, we have Dr. Ellis Monk. Dr. Monk, can you hear us? Maybe? All right, well, we have, okay, it looks like he's just on mute. Okay, wonderful. So I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Monk and we'll let him get started. So Dr. Ellis Monk is a professor of sociology at Harvard University and a visiting faculty researcher at Google. His award-winning research focuses on the comparative examination of social inequality, especially with respect to race and ethnicity and global perspective. This research uses both quantitative and qualitative methods while drawing heavily upon contemporary theories of social cognition and categories. By deeply engaging with issues of measurement and methodology, it examines the complex relationships between social categories and social inequality and extends into topics such as social demography, wow, demography, health, aging, social psychology, sociology of the body, race and technology, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, and comparative historical sociology. He is a 2022 recipient of an NIH Director's New Innovator Award, which supports his research on race, skin tone, and pulse oximetry. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Ellis Monk. I know that we had some very engaging questions from the last session. Does anyone have anything else they wanted to ask about color or any other things that we want to bring up in this session here? Yes.
Do you have to have a mathematical background to get into color science?
That's a great question. I don't think you have to. I think it depends on how deep into color science you want to go, if you need to have a math background. I know for myself personally, I had a pretty strong math background, so it made getting into color science pretty easy. But someone like my fiance, Jared, math is not his favorite subject, but being able to understand how the technology works and how color spaces and those things in color management, how those work, that is more easily accessible to him. It's something tangible. So it depends on what side of it you want to be on. And I think that's the cool collaboration between those of us who are more scientific and mathematically inclined. We work with creatives to figure out what tools work best for them and how to make sure that they can use those tools easily and efficient to quickly get their creative vision completed. Thank you for that question.
When you entered undergrad, were you going in for color or did you transition? Like, how did you learn that color science was a thing to pursue?
No, actually. So when I went to school, I thought I was going to go into post-production. I thought I was going to be an editor. That's what I did as a kid. So similar to a story I think John was saying, I was the kid who took my parents' camera and was making home videos. And then that turned into creating edits and putting video projects together for school. So that's what I thought I was going to do. So I went to college. I saw that there was a track that featured a lot of math that was combined with the editing that I like to do. Oh, it looks like we have Dr. Monk. So enough about me and my story. Let's go ahead and hand it back over to Dr. Monk to learn about his research. Thank you so much for your patience with that.
I'll go ahead and jump in and get started. Thank you so much for accommodating me virtually. I'll just jump right in. So the title of my talk is The Unceasing Significance of Colorism from the Social to the Social Technical. And it's Black History Month. I'm sure we've all seen and heard this quote a substantial amount of times, so I won't even repeat it here. I'll just point out that what Dr. King was doing here is something called metonymy, which is he's doing a common linguistic substitution rooted in the equivalence of belonging to this broad aggregate ethno-racial category and the highly conspicuous marker that people use in interaction to ascribe people into the category Black. Basically, he's substituting skin color for membership in the category Black. And of course, this slippage between color and racial membership, like in this category, the census category, was no bar to the efficacy of this famous line, right? Everyone understood and understands what Dr. King meant, right? But I'd like to point out that this slippage between skin color as a marker of belonging or ascription into an ethno-racial category obscures the differences between skin color as a characteristic and ethno-racial categories or the category Black as a whole. In particular, it obscures colorism, right, which is the system of discrimination based on the lightness or darkness of people's skin tone that, at least in the United States, originated in slavery, where you had lighter skinned African Americans, mixed race people, mulattoes, etc., who had direct kinship ties to whites, and this was often tied to sexual violence by whites on the plantation that gave rise to this population of lighter skinned and mixed race Black people in the first place. And the vast majority of the free Black population during slavery was composed of lighter skinned, mixed race, African Americans, mulattoes, etc. And especially after emancipation, this meant that these, lighter skin, mixed race African Americans who had these kinship ties to whites, they were much more likely to have learned a trade, to know how to read. So they had a huge set of advantages relative to everyone else. And this kind of got skin color hierarchies and stratification started way back hundreds of years ago. So if we think about the present day, the reality is that within that category of Black, you have a great, vast, amount of heterogeneity in terms of phenotypical traits. And as Hortense Powdermaker pointed out in her 1939 ethnographic work, she said that within the Negro, every possible shade of color between jet black and creamy white exists, and variations occur even within the same shade. And if we look at the U.S. Census from 1910, which still used enumerators, people who would go around and ascribe people into ethno-racial categories, they noted that 21% of the Black population were so-called visibly mulatto. And this has a long history in the United States. If we think about the category Black and the heterogeneity within it, both in terms of ancestry and phenotypical traits. So I have a picture here of some of the co-founders of the NAACP. You've got W.E. Du Bois. On one hand of the screen, you have Walter White, who's pictured in the middle there with Roy Wilkins and Thurgood Marshall, who rather famously passed for white throughout the South to report on lynchings that had taken place there. Now, he's a co-founder of the NAACP. And the point here is to highlight that even though phenotypically people could not really distinguish him from other white people, the reality is that he self-identified as Black based on his ancestry in accordance with the one drop rule. And people dug into his background thinking that because of his phenotype, maybe he was somewhat like mixed race and all these sorts of things. But the reality is they went back several generations in Walter White's family, and they found that he had Black parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, the reality is that even when you have like full Black parentage, it only really takes one or two mixings way, way, way back down the line. And what some people refer to as color-based homogamy, where people of lighter skin tones are marrying each other, to produce someone like Walter White, who is able to pass for white and report on these lynchings in the South and is this like great civil rights leader and all of these things, right? So what I like to highlight about the U.S. in particular, before I like dive into all the statistics and whatnot on colorism, is that the reality is in the United States, the one drop rule, this idea that one drop of Black blood is enough to ascribe someone into the category Black and for them to self-identify as Black. The reality is, for most of U.S. history, we didn't really have the one drop rule. And in fact, this book that I have a picture of the cover by Joel Williamson shows very clearly that depending on what part of the country you were in, both during slavery and going into even Jim Crow, there were multiple ways of thinking about Blackness, even gradationally. So you have multiple categories like mulatto, quadrant, octorant, all these categories that denote kind of these different ancestral mixes, not just that one is just Black or white. So in reality, we have a much more complicated way of thinking about Blackness, really for most of U.S. history. And it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century, in particular with things like the NAACP and people like Du Bois and the Harlem Renaissance, that you see this kind of unification of the category Black, regardless of skin tone, regardless of ancestral mixes. So much so that today it's pretty much taken for granted that the category Black is this kind of internally homogenous category, and people really don't pay a lot of attention or even use these terms like octorant, quadrant, even mulatto. These terms are more so seen as kind of almost offensive even today. But for most of U.S. history, people use multiple gradational categories to refer to all of the heterogeneity in terms of ancestry and phenotype. That's all held under the same umbrella of just Black. Okay? So in my research as a sociologist, one thing that I point out is that the way people tend to think about racial inequality, ethno-racial inequality, is they tend to think about these census categories as kind of the main way to think about inequality in our society. But in reality, this is a very inadequate approach to thinking about inequality, especially with respect to race, ethnicity. These state categories, or census categories, at least since 1970, are based largely on self-identification. So they don't really pick up on how other people may ascribe you into ethno-racial categories. They're often taken to be internally homogenous groups, like there's no meaningful differences within that census category. Again, in terms of phenotype and ancestral differences, right? And there's a presumption that there's no meaningful like differences. Everyone's kind of equally in the category, which if we think, philosophically here for just a second, before I get into some of the kind of nitty gritty details with the stats on colorism, the reality is this kind of way of thinking that we walk around the world and just categorize in this kind of dichotomous nominal way. People are either black or white or Latino, Hispanic, etc., that we just see these kind of stark black and white nominal differences is something that came under attack by the philosopher Wittgenstein several decades ago. And it was really taken up by Eleanor Rosch, the social psychologist, who talked about this not in terms of racial categories, but in terms of the natural world, talking about birds and talking about the fact that when we think about the category bird, it includes things like robins and cardinals that usually come to mind very quickly, but it also includes things like penguins, which are like atypical members of this category bird. And the point that Rosch is making, inspired by Wittgenstein, is that processes of categorization are much more complex than just thinking about whether or not something is or is not, right? The reality is that there's lots of different features that we use to define all these different members of the category bird, and there's lots of heterogeneity there. So a prototypical bird may be of a certain size, may have feathers, may have a beak, may be able to fly, may like all these sorts of hedging words that you see in the dictionary when you want a clear-cut definition. The reality is there's all these hedging words because categorization is often fuzzy. It's not always simply nominal and dichotomous. It's much more complex than that. And that's the same thing we see with ethno-racial categories. That same level of complexity. Even things in like metals, for instance, if you were to look up the definition of the word metal and look at the history of how people thought around how to define what is or is not a metal, you'll see all this fuzziness, which is to say that the world is much more complex than just saying people are black or white. And people don't even agree around like the definition of things like what is or is not a metal. So the point is to say there's a lot more complexity beyond these census categories and the way that people typically tend to think about ethno-racial difference and inequality. And what the state is usually doing then with these kind of neat boxes that they put everyone in is it's reducing all of that complexity into these crisp, nominal, often dichotomous differences that are easily handled in their bureaucratic systems, right? But that's not actually the reality. And I'll skip through some of that in the interest of time and just get into colorism, which I think illustrates all of these complexities. So to be clear, census, race, ethnicity, and skin color are not the same characteristic. And my work on colorism shows, for instance, that there's actually as much socioeconomic inequality along the skin color continuum from light to dark among African Americans as there is between African Americans and whites as a whole, which is a very counterintuitive way, I think, of thinking about racial inequality. And in fact, this isn't just among Black people. You see colorism effects among Latinx, Asian Americans, immigrants and non-immigrants, from things from earnings to education and health and all sorts of different outcomes, which I'll talk about today. And even more broadly, colorism is actually a global phenomenon. We see it in India, we see it in Latin America, we see it on the African continent. So this isn't just a Black thing. It's not just a US thing. This is a global problem of colorism and skin tone stratification all around the world. Though today my remarks will focus on the United States. So one finding from my research that kind of illustrates the kind of unceasing significance of colorism is that if we were to look at the US Black population between the ages of 25 and 44, I find that there's actually 15.4 months of educational inequality comparing those who are judged to be very light-skinned and very dark-skinned, okay? And that's actually larger than the 10.2 months of education gap that we see between Blacks and whites as a whole. We also see similar kinds of disparities in the criminal justice system, where people tend to point out that things like socioeconomic class and education play a large role in who ends up getting arrested, incarcerated, etc. So much so that some people point to social class as a way of thinking about criminal justice inequalities that's maybe more important than someone's race. But in one of my studies, what I showed was that even controlling for socioeconomic class among African Americans and all sorts of other factors, I find that those who are darker skinned have dramatically higher probabilities of having ever been arrested. And in fact, these gaps between the very lightest and very darkest skin among African Americans are somewhat similar to the gaps between blacks and whites as a whole in terms of who's ever been arrested during their life. I find similar effects in terms of incarceration. Again, even controlling for education, earnings, etc., which in my research world and social science suggests that there's some sort of skin color bias that's going on, because even after we control for someone's education, their employment, their earnings, what part of the country they're in, we still see this significant association between someone's skin tone and the probability that they've ever been arrested or even incarcerated. And again, these gaps along the skin color continuum, just among Black people, is actually somewhat larger than the gaps that we find in incarceration between Blacks and whites as a whole. And this is all using nationally representative data. We also see these sorts of disparities in the world of health, which, I do a lot of work on ethno-racial health disparities, where I think lots of people realize that there are these huge gaps in life expectancy and in morbidity, like the probability of having a certain illness or disease. But there are some questions in this field. One is that health disparities between Blacks and whites often remain even after you control for socioeconomic class and health behaviors. And again, health disparities within race are often as large or even larger than what you see between Blacks and whites or between races as a whole. Again, kind of counterintuitive, I think, relative to the kind of common discourse we tend to have on ethno-racial inequality. My research and the research of others shows that there's actually significant intra-racial gaps in mental and physical health among African Americans that are associated with skin tone, once again. And in fact, these gaps in mental and physical health actually rival health disparities between Blacks and whites as a whole. And in fact, there's even some research that's used sibling studies and even controlled for genetics and found similar things. This particular study used AdHealth, which is a nationally representative data set. And they found that even after they controlled for kitchen sink and genes, that there are these differences in hypertension between lighter and darker skinned siblings. Again, showing, at least in my world, that discrimination as a factor that people need to reckon with in their daily lives can be a source of social stress that leads them to have poor mental and physical health. And we find this even controlling for everything you could imagine. Now, one of my more recent studies, I wanted to take an intersectional approach to thinking about how skin color, but also things like lookism, discrimination on the basis of physical appearance, notions of beauty, may play a role on the labor market. What I've shown you so far is that we have these educational disparities, we have criminal justice disparities associated with colorism, we have health disparities, we have all these different disparities, but another thing to consider here is not just skin tone, but also notions of beauty and how those things may be racialized in such a way that affect how much people earn on the labor market. So this particular study, which I co-authored with colleagues from Duke University and the University of Minnesota, Hetty Lee at Duke and Mike Esposito at University of Minnesota, asked two questions. One is attractiveness, perceptions of attractiveness, which of course are socially constructed, equally distributed by race and gender? And do returns to physical attractiveness vary by the intersection of race and gender? And Daniel Hammermash, who's pretty famous for being kind of one of the main pioneers behind all of these studies on beauty and how beauty is associated with inequality, he actually kind of surmised that the effects of beauty within the Black population might be smaller than what you find among white people. There's a whole host of studies showing how much being perceived to be physically attractive adds in terms of, like beauty premia on the labor market, even after controlling for ability, credentials. Some studies even try to, control for IQ, all of which kind of signals that this is another realm of discrimination in society, even though it's not technically illegal, which I'll talk about in a second. But in any case, in this paper, we actually argued the opposite of Hammermash, because to the extent that perceptions of physical attractiveness are both racialized and gendered, and there's a whole long literature making this argument that I won't rehearse works here, then beauty will actually be unequally distributed by race and gender. And then that means the returns to beauty as a form of what I refer to as bodily capital on the labor market, those returns actually will be different depending on what ethno-racial category and what gender you are. In particular, I argue that intersectionally, we may find a form of triple jeopardy, where many Black women in particular may be denied this important form of bodily capital on the labor market, and they then will be discriminated on the basis of their ethno-racial category, Black, gender discrimination, and then also discrimination on the basis of perceived attractiveness simultaneously. Now, one wrinkle in this, though, is that means that for those Black women who are actually judged to be highly physically attractive on the labor market, from the vantage point of whites, I must say in this nationally representative data set, and this was a feature, not a bug, most of the people judging attractiveness were white. So we're actually kind of simulating the labor market in this study. But that means that those women who are the exception to the rule, who have this form of bodily capital in the labor market, their earnings actually should be very high. Okay. And that's actually what we find in the study, but I'll get there in a second. So first of all, the distribution of perceptions of beauty, we do find this inequality, especially among women, where Black women in particular are judged to have lower levels of attractiveness relative to white and Hispanic. Among men, you also find that gap, but it's not as dramatic, which speaks to the racialization and the gendering of notions of beauty that people often point to as Eurocentric. One thing in this study that we did was we looked at the relationship between skin tone and these ratings of beauty on the labor market, and we found a very, very strong effect where darker skinned people were tending to be rated as less attractive than everyone else. And we also did modeling for things like BMI and height. We don't have a hair texture in this particular model, but of course, that's another thing that people talk about a lot, which is certain hair textures and types are discriminated against on the labor market and in the broader society and judged to be less beautiful. And then in terms of the actual returns to attractiveness, what we find here is that attractiveness matters for everyone on the labor market, which certainly fits all of the existing studies. But if you look for Black women in particular, those judged to be at the kind of highest levels of socially perceived attractiveness, those Black women's earnings actually cross over and exceed that of white and Hispanic women, which kind of points to this whole exception to the rule effect that we theorized before we did our analysis. Now, you may be wondering, well, how much does something like beauty matter? It certainly can't matter as much as something like race and gender. But in fact, what we find here is if you control for all the different factors that you need to control for education, all forms of other capital in the labor market, and you compare those in the 5th percentile to the 95th percentile of perceived attractiveness, the gap among white men, for instance, is 88 cents to $1. Okay. Now, the Black-white race gap is 87 cents to $1, which is showing that the effect of beauty on the labor market just among white men is actually something similar to the Black-white race gap, even though lookism, as it's referred to, is legal and, people don't really take it all that seriously. But this is a very important dimension of inequality and stratification in our society. Now, if you look what happens among African Americans, among Black people, you see among Black men, it's 61 cents to $1 comparing the 5th and the 95th percentile. And among Black women, it's 63 cents to $1 comparing the 5th and the 95th percentile. All of which is to say, attractiveness matters for everyone on the labor market, but the effects for Black people in particular are extreme. And in the paper, we, go through great length explaining how this just shows the role of colorism on the labor market even stronger, because skin color and colorism is associated with these notions of beauty, which are highly Eurocentric and racialized. So I would be remiss not to mention the global skin whitening and skin lightening industry, right? People often kind of blame the victim and they point out that people use these skin lightening creams and all of this. But there's a broader story here, of course. People are using these different bleaching creams and all of this, which are extremely toxic and dangerous and have been outlawed in many countries around the world. But they're using this, one could argue, in response to all of these pressures, not only in the labor market, but the marriage market, et cetera, because they're dealing with this broader system of discrimination in terms of colorism and lookism that takes place all around the world, which is highly Eurocentric. Yeah. There's just another slide kind of showing people covering this, especially on the African continent in the past couple of decades, where there's, studies that show kind of harsh chemicals that are in some of these skin lightening creams. So I'd like to shift a little bit to what I refer to as colorblind technology and really the socio-technical aspect of colorism. So far, I've covered, discrimination as a form of social stress that affects health. I've talked about colorism and lookism on the labor market. I've talked about colorism in terms of the criminal justice system and all those things. But there's another way that colorism and skin tone stratification manifests itself, and it's through technology. Okay, so I have a picture here of a Shirley card that was something that was used by Kodak to calibrate skin tones, lighting, and shadows and their photo printing system. And as the story goes, the thinking back then was that if it looked good for Shirley, it looked good for everyone. Shirley was the standard, so as you can see there on the slide, it actually even says normal next to all of these different women. And it probably should come as no surprise to us today in 2024 that this practice of using a Shirley card, which almost always was a white model, came under attack after decades of criticism against Kodak for not having adequate skin tone and ethnoracial representation in their calibration system. And as the story goes, kind of strangely, it was actually chocolate companies and furniture companies that led the charge in getting this problem fixed, because the furniture companies would kind of point out that certain shades of brown didn't look quite right. And the chocolate companies would also point out like some of the different shades of brown in their chocolates didn't look right when Kodak was printing pictures of them. So it wasn't even like human being like activism that was like at the forefront of changing this practice. It was actually chocolate companies and furniture companies, which is disturbing. And the BBC also used something similar to the Shirley card. They used cardboard cake. Okay. All of which is to kind of highlight that this is another way that skin tone and colorism can manifest itself in our society. It's when different forms of technology are used and produced that don't take skin tone representation and diversity into account. And that means that these different forms of technology don't work equally well or at all for anyone who isn't lighter skin or white. And we see this manifest in artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is something I've been involved in. I'll talk about a little bit later. But we see this with autonomous cars, self-driving cars that don't recognize pedestrians with darker skin tones because they weren't trained in environments that have adequate skin tone representation and diversity. So these cars literally just don't even recognize darker skinned people as human beings to be avoided on the road. We also see this in the realm of dermatology, where dermatologists are not trained and they're not trained adequately to deal with patients of different skin tones. Even the textbooks, the imagery in the textbooks don't have adequate skin tone diversity and representation. So it's really hard for people, clinicians in particular, to recognize different skin conditions with people of darker skin. We often see this in terms of like eczema and psoriasis and even things like diaper rash with little kids. But we see it in things like lupus and wounds and all other sorts of dermatological contexts where people are not trained adequately to deal with people of different skin tones. We also see this in the realm of pulse oximetry, which is something I've been deeply involved in. I have a $2.5 million grant from the NIH and the NIMH looking at skin tone representation and errors in pulse oximetry associated with skin tone. Right now, current FDA regulations suggest that at least 2 volunteers in some of these, they're small scale validation studies for these pulse oximeters, but it raises the question of who is darkly pigmented or not to be involved in these validation studies. Of course, if you don't have an adequate measure of skin tone to take skin tone into account, then you might actually have lighter skinned people testing these devices, and then you put these devices out on the market, and the thinking is that they work equally well for everyone, when in fact they don't. And there's lots of studies, especially during COVID, the pandemic, that have shown that these devices are significantly less accurate for everyone who is not lighter skin or white. In particular, with these devices, you know, they're used to make all sorts of different decisions in the ER, and even people at home have bought these devices to kind of, you know, monitor themselves when they get sick. And you may get a number on this device if you're, say, like a white person or lighter skin, and it may say 97, 98, 99, and that's fairly accurate. But if a black person or a darker skinned person takes that same device and tries to use it, and they see a 97 or 98, some of the studies show that that 97 or 98 might actually be a 93 or a 94. And as you go down further in terms of levels of oxygenation, the errors actually increase according to many studies, which shows that these devices may not work equally well for people who are darker skinned or anyone who is not extremely lighter skinned, because most of these devices, the thinking is they were not adequately tested in terms of the entire skin tone continuum. And this has been really a matter of life or death, delayed treatment, lack of treatment for people who are not darker, who are not lighter skinned. So in terms of my involvement in this work, in particular, I've been, you know, kind of part of a group of people who are trying to replace what has been up until this point, the gold standard in terms of skin tone classification, not just in terms of dermatology and pulse oximetry, but just broadly the Fitzpatrick scale, which was designed in 1975 by Dr. Thomas Fitzpatrick, also of Harvard, but Harvard Medical School. And it was actually intended to categorize how skin reacts to UV during phototherapy. And it was for Caucasians, for whites specifically. Now, what's interesting here is that even when used as intended, studies have shown that it doesn't quite work that well. But it certainly was not designed for skin tone classification, and certainly not in a global or even kind of nationally representative way in the United States. In fact, originally it only had 4 shades, and then 10 years after it was launched, 2 more shades were added. And here's a picture of the Fitzpatrick scale. And studies show that this scale may overestimate the percentage of the black population that would be judged to have type 4 on this scale. And again, one of the things that I found in kind of studying the scale and studying different skin tone scales is that the Fitzpatrick scale in particular may actually have 2 problems, because it lives in this intermediate zone in terms of the skin tone continuum. It's simultaneously too dark for many lighter skinned people and not dark enough for many darker skinned people. So there's actually kind of two problems going on here. So a few years ago, I launched the Monk skin tone scale, and here is a picture of that, which I explicitly designed to measure skin tone in diverse populations. It's easy to use, reliable, cost-effective means of measuring skin tone. It's open source, so people can use it for free. And the main way that I designed it to mitigate some of these biases relative to prior visual scales is to include a wider range of carefully selected skin tones to represent the dynamic range of skin tones we see in the United States and beyond. And in particular, it was based on my field work in the US and Brazil, lots of computer software I use, and different maps of distribution of UV and skin tone around the world. And it was validated through cognitive interviewing I did as part of NSHAP, which is the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project that's run out of the University of Chicago, and NORC, which is a gold standard health, aging, and epidemiologically focused survey, which has received over $50 million in funding from the NIH and NIA. And I led cognitive interviewing to validate the scale, and it was adopted in NSHAP back in 2021. And the scale was then, a year after that or so, adopted by Google, and they've used this Monk skin tone scale in a wide array of different products and different instances across Google, from their image search engine to testing the real tone filters on the Pixel camera. So, I mean, they use it in all kinds of different ways, ways I'm not probably even supposed to speak about. But in any case, we also did some US validation and some global validation of the scale. And one of the main findings that we have in our US validation study, which was published, earlier this year is that the Monk skin tone scale is perceived to be more inclusive than the Fitzpatrick scale, and also as inclusive as a 40-point scale, the Fenty scale from the cosmetics industry. So again, it does a lot. The Monk skin tone scale does a lot with less, basically. It's 4 times smaller than the Fenty scale. We've also done global validation, looking at annotation, basically just kind of, looking at the levels of consensus around the world using the scale. We find, following the kind of convention with these subjective scales of plus or minus 1 on the scale, high levels of inter-rater reliability and consensus. Within the global pool, for instance, we see consensus annotation within 1 point for 95% of our global pool of different pictures that we use. We have this thing called the MIST-E data set, the Monk scale data set, that we have a wide representation of different models of different skin tones, and we basically set up an annotation task for people all around the world to use the scale and try to come up with their ratings. In any case, we find high levels of inter-rater reliability and consensus, anything ranging from 0.9 to 0.96 using the golden images data set, which are, well-lit images. We also made things a little more difficult. We made a challenging images data set for our annotators as well, which reduces the lighting conditions ridiculously and really, really makes it harder to make skin tone ratings in particular. And even then, we still see 0.82 to 0.95 in terms of inter-rater reliability. So even with images that are poorly lit, we see that. Now, one of the kind of cool things from a research perspective that has been done with the Monk skin tone scale at Google is to look at skin tone and colorism in terms of casting and representation on TV and in movies. And I'm sure lots of you are kind of familiar with the discussions that have been had in recent years around colorism and casting. In The Heights, for instance, caught a lot of flack for not casting darker skinned people and Afro-Latinos in particular. People have talked about TV diversity in terms of skin tone for quite some time. And what Google did, along with the Gina Davis Institute in 2022, was do a report on representation on TV using the Monk skin tone scale to measure skin tone. And one of the things that they find is that over this period from 2010 to 2021, characters with lighter skin made up the vast majority of characters on the screen. And in fact, in 2010, the estimated gap in the share of screen time between characters with light and dark skin was 81%, which is huge. In 2021, they found that the gap narrowed to 55%, but it's still a pretty large disparity. And there's just a plot of that work showing that it has improved somewhat over time, but there's still these dramatic gaps in terms of who is speaking on the screen, who's represented on the screen. And this isn't just like looking at casting. This is actually looking like who's speaking, what's their role on the particular TV show. The Monk skin tone scale has also been adopted by Meta, Facebook, and Casual Conversations V2 to measure algorithmic bias. They also use it in terms of Facet, which is this computer vision evaluation data set as well. So more and more companies are beginning to adopt the scale to kind of serve as a benchmark for looking at skin tone representation. All of which is to say that in my ideal world, I'd be able to do some more studies on skin tone representation on TV and ads and movies. I think there's just a lot of work to be done, looking much more closely at skin tone representation, looking beyond these census categories and paying much more attention to who we see on the screen and who's reflected back at these audiences, not just in the United States, but globally. So some concluding thoughts here. First of all, I think as should be clear, kind of, beating it to death a little bit here. Census, race, ethnicity, and skin tone are not the same characteristic. There's considerable heterogeneity in skin tone and other phenotypical features, facial features, hair texture, etc., within and across census categories, okay? There's tons of phenotypical heterogeneity there that's not captured when we just think in terms of who fits into what box they checked, okay? And evidence shows globally that skin tone is associated with education, earnings, employment, health, and much more in countries all around the world. Okay? And I would add to that, thinking about lookism, which is closely related to colorism, this system of discrimination in terms of perceptions of beauty, which are, tend to be Eurocentric, racialized, and gendered, etc. And while much attention then is often paid to, race, ethnicity, and racism, relatively little attention tends to be paid to color, colorism, and lookism, even though these factors have massive effects all around the world. Colorism affects life chances and outcomes both through social and socio-technical mechanisms. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. I think that in lieu of the technical difficulties, we might give you some of your time back that we took in your break. I encourage you to email Dr. Monk any questions that you may have and continue looking into his research. And I want to thank you all for joining our Power of Color workflow session this morning. I hope that whether you are someone new to the industry or someone who's been in here for a while, that you're able to take something away from today. So I will turn it over to our wonderful NC and to talk about what's next coming up in the day. Thank you all so much again.